Okay, so let's make a start. So welcome today to our seminar. And so we try something new today. We're in a lecture theatre actually at UEA. And so people could come in if they want to. It might be too late now, or you can attend online. But it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Wong, who's an NHMRC research fellow. So Stephanie was a PhD student actually of mine quite a while ago, but then did a postdoctoral work in Sydney and is now based at Flinders University in Adelaide. And she's here for a visit, so we're delighted to have her here. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat so we can go through them later after Stephanie finished her presentation, and we can go through all the questions then in turn. So I'll hand over to Stephanie, and who will talk about financial capability in aging and dementia, development of a new novel neuropsychological test. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Michael. Hopefully everyone can hear me if I just stand around here. Look over the screen to see you in person. But yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to present to you all today. As Michael mentioned, I'll be talking a bit about some of the work I started in my postdoctoral training kind of period. Most of this work was done in Sydney, but also a lot of it was shifted online, of course, because of COVID. So I'll talk through a couple of these studies today, as well as show a bit of preliminary data on this new test that we've developed and some exciting new directions that we're taking this. I guess I should probably also mention by way of background, I'm a neuropsychologist, and I did my PhD with Michael in the field of dementia research and memory. So we know in older people and people with dementia that financial skills can decline, and I guess in the general population, financial capability is really important for independent living. So you need to be able to manage your money, you need to be able to pay bills, organize your finances, do everyday budgeting, things like that. So when cognition does decline due to aging or dementia, this can often have a really a large impact on financial capability. So some of the things I was noticing working clinically and seeing patients in the clinic was reports from caregivers. So things like, oh, you know, just finding it a bit more difficult to do maths and kind of do calculations. He's given up more responsibilities. So he used to be the person who was paying bills and making big financial decisions, but he's not doing this anymore. But then also ranging through to things like, oh, he's actually signed up to some financial schemes that he doesn't use, or, oh, he's given more than $600,000 to a African gold scheme, which is clearly a scam, but denies any problems with his judgment or decision making. So quite a range of different types of financial difficulties reported by these carers. And if we think about how to classify these, I guess one underlying theme is you could classify these broadly into financial errors versus financial exploitation. So your errors are more related to difficulties managing your personal finances, more of the cognitive side of things, whereas financial exploitation kind of takes this a bit further, and there is actually an abuse of trust in order to gain access to another person's money or property. So there's an extra sort of element here with the financial exploitation. So over the years, there have been several, I guess, theories proposed to think about the possible contributing factors to these sorts of difficulties. So on the one hand, you have cognitive factors, so being able to attend to certain information, work with this information in your working memory, being able to remember that you've paid the bills is probably a useful skill. Otherwise, if you might make the mistake of paying it twice or not paying it at all. But also other things like language, so being able to read complex information. Sometimes reading a bill that you might get from a credit card company can be quite complex, as well as executive functions. So being able to multitask, plan, organize, prioritize certain bits of information and things like that. and also problem solving. But then on the other side, you also have social-emotional factors. So this probably feeds more into those financial exploitation issues, where people's social and emotional perception might affect how well they might be able to pick up certain social cues from other people to decide whether they might be trustworthy or not so trustworthy. And I guess theory of mind, so being able to take the perspective of another person, attribute intention to other people, as well as sensitivity to gains and losses, so monetary gains and losses. Sometimes when these skills start to decline, people might become hypersensitive to gains or losses. So this is all kind of quite vague, but more recently there has been a more, I guess, concrete model proposed. So this is the social cognitive neuroscience model of financial vulnerability. This was proposed by Nathan Sprang and colleagues. This was published in a book chapter recently, actually. But yeah, so Sprang and colleagues really proposed that for financial exploitation in particular, I'll just use the mouse, hopefully you can see that. There are really two major pathways that could lead to a person having an increased risk for financial exploitation. So on the cognitive pathway, you have a reduction in fluid reasoning, so being able to problem solve, certain judgments and things like that. But at the same time, as people get older, they do also have accumulated crystallized knowledge and experience of, I guess, different financial situations they might have been in. And with these reductions or changes in cognitive capacity, together with age-related changes in brain structure and function, a person might be more likely to mismanage their finances. So there might be some changes in their monetary skills, their knowledge and judgment. Now, on the other hand, you have these social capacity or social cognitive skills. So being able to detect deception, being able to judge whether someone is being trustworthy or not. These social skills, coupled with changes or associated changes in brain structure and function, can then lead to an increased susceptibility to gullibility or being influenced by other people. And so together, the combination of difficulties with managing finances and an increased susceptibility to social influence can lead to a higher risk for financial exploitation. You'll also notice that there are some little kind of dotted arrows here in between because, of course, social cognitive skills can sometimes also be related to cognition in general and executive functioning. So it's not as super clear-cut, and especially in people with dementia, they can have both cognitive and social cognitive impairments. So there are some interrelationships here. So that's the model that has been proposed. But prior to that, we were already starting to look at different types of financial skills across different dementia subtypes. And the bulk of the research has been done, of course, in Alzheimer's disease because it is the most common type of dementia. But a lot of my work is focused on not just Alzheimer's disease, but also behavioural variant FTD or frontotemporal dementia. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with these, so I might just go through quickly the different presentations of these types of dementia. So, of course, Alzheimer's disease is really characterised by memory loss. So a lot of difficulties with learning and remembering new information. People can be very disoriented to time and place. And patients also present with some degree of executive dysfunction, particularly as they progress in their disease. So really some difficulties with flexibility, planning, judgment, and reasoning. On the other hand, you have behavioural variant FTD, which is a much rarer, younger onset type of dementia, so typically affecting people under the age of 65. Now, with these patients, the most prominent change is in their behaviour. So they often present with very socially inappropriate behaviour. They have changes in social cognition, so really quite a lot of difficulties with emotion recognition, emotion perception, and theory of mind. So deficits in perspective taking, but also at the same time, they do show a lot of impulsivity and can be quite disinhibited. But at the same time, they also present with quite a bit of executive dysfunction as well. So similar changes in flexibility, planning, judgment, and reasoning, as you see in Alzheimer's disease patients. So with these two, I guess, broad patient groups in mind, the first study I'm going to present here is looking at some questionnaire measures of financial errors and exploitation in these patient groups. So as a measure of financial errors, we used the Disability Assessment for Dementia, or the DAD. It's not the perfect scale. Of course, this is a retrospective study, so we used what we had. So this scale has three finance-related items, which I've just shown here. So reporting less interest in personal finances, difficulty organising their finances, such as bills, and a question about handling cash. And as our measure of financial exploitation, we use the social vulnerability scale. And this is a scale that's been developed for use in older adults in Australia. So one of the subscales of this, the SBS, is the gullibility subscale. And it asks specific questions about, I guess, financial exploitation, and really asks people to rate how often the person has been persuaded to give away personal information, or persuaded to buy things they don't need, things like that. So both of these are informant rated scales. So what we see in the two patient groups is actually with the financial error items, it does seem to be a bit more common in your Alzheimer's disease patients, but statistically there is no significant difference between the scores on this particular measure. Whereas with the gullibility scale, you do see quite a significant difference between the two patient groups. So the behavioural variant FTD patients are more likely to be persuaded to give away money or personal information and things like that, compared to both the controls and the Alzheimer's disease patients. Oh, I should also mention that we didn't have any control data for the DAD, because this was collected in patients only. So already you can see quite some differences in the profiles of financial errors versus exploitation in these two patient groups. But what's interesting is when we had a closer look at associations with other kind of cognitive and socio-emotional functions in these patient groups. So it was just a basic correlation analysis with other data that we had collected. So in Alzheimer's disease, financial errors were associated with changes in attention and cognitive flexibility, whereas in behavioural variant FTD, their financial errors were more related to deficits in inhibitory control. This is something we measured using the Haveling sentence completion task. On the other hand, when looking at financial exploitation, so the gullibility subscale, we see that in Alzheimer's disease, the risk for financial exploitation was associated with changes in working memory and episodic memory. Whereas in the behavioural variant FTD patients, those who were more susceptible to financial exploitation showed poorer performance on emotion recognition tests. So being able to recognise how other people are feeling. So what this study highlights really is that these two different dementia subtypes show very different profiles in terms of their susceptibility to financial errors and exploitation. So in Alzheimer's disease, financial errors are common, and it seems to be related to changes in attention and cognitive flexibility. But in general, they do also have a much lower susceptibility to financial exploitation, which, even though it was lower, it was related to changes more related to working memory and episodic memory. Now, on the other hand, you have behavioural variant FTD patients where financial errors are also common, but it seems to be related to different underlying factors. So it's more related to their changes in inhibitory control. And in these patients in particular, we find much higher rates of susceptibility to financial exploitation. And in particular, this seems to be related to their deficits in emotion recognition, which is also, it's one of the social cognitive factors, and social cognition is particularly effective in these patients. So really, by understanding these different profiles and their underlying cognitive and social emotional mechanisms, we hope that this will help inform management strategies for dealing with these sorts of problems in these patients. But also leads to a lot of really interesting questions in general about financial errors and exploitation in people with dementia. And so that leads me to how we actually currently assess financial capacity or capability in the clinic. So the previous study I was talking about, that was really more questionnaire-based, informant-rated measures that might not necessarily always be used in the clinic. And I mean, certainly we don't tend to use the gullibility measure commonly in the clinic. But thinking back to practice as a neuropsychologist, one of the most common referral questions, I guess, for older adults is the question of financial capacity. Does this person have capacity to make their own decisions regarding selling their house or where they want to live or things like that? And so I'm not sure what we do in the UK, but what we do in Australia at least is use a more of a legal definition of capacity because, and I'll explain how this differs, how capacity versus capability might differ. So thinking specifically at the legal definition of capacity, a person has capacity if they can make decisions about things that affect them personally, but they need to just be able to demonstrate these 5 factors here. So they need to be able to understand the facts, understand the main choices, they should be able to weigh up the consequences of these choices, and also understand how these consequences affect them. And of course, they need to be able to communicate whatever the decision is at that time. And so if you look at all of these factors, the legal terminology of capacity is really decision specific. So when you ask these questions about whether a person can make a particular decision, so whether this person has capacity to sell their house, for example, this definition or this decision about whether they have capacity is really specific only to that person's decision to sell their house or not. And so there are a set of guidelines in New South Wales. We use the capacity toolkit, but really this is sort of a guideline of the sorts of questions you should be asking a client or patient when they come in for a capacity assessment. And these are questions like, what bank accounts do you have? Where do you get your money from? And all these very specific questions about the decision they're making at the time. But of course, these are also recommended guidelines, so there's no real consistency across what people are doing in the clinic and which specific questions they're using and things like that. So there have been some attempts to, I guess, formalize the kind of questions that you ask. So for example, this is the Lichtenberg Financial Decision Rating Scale, which was actually developed in the US. So there's slightly different terminology, but overall, same sort of factors. You need to be able to communicate choice, understanding, appreciation, and rationale for the particular decision. And so they've put together a sort of checklist. So this is the short version here. So really, you can see that these sorts of scales and checklists are really specific to that particular decision that the person might be making at the time. So there are, pros and cons. So pros is it's very detailed, it's systematic, and the questions are based on the legal definition of financial capacity. But the downsides of a checklist such as this is it doesn't really assess a person's general financial skills. It's really specific to this particular decision that they're trying to make. And there's no specific questions about risk for financial exploitation. And even though it is a standardized checklist, scoring can be somewhat subjective, and it's also quite verbal. So if a person has difficulties with their verbal skills, they might not be able to express their opinion. It doesn't necessarily mean that they lack capacity. And because it is really tied to this particular decision that is that they're trying to make, these sorts of measures might not particularly be useful for example, comparing pre-post any targeted interventions to support financial capability. So that's one example of a scale. But there are also existing measures of financial skills more generally. So for example, this is the Financial Competence Assessment Inventory, or the FCAI. developed by Kershaw and Weber back in 2004. I think this one was developed in Australia, and it does have some questions in general about everyday financial abilities, judgment, estate management. It also has a couple of sub-tests looking at, I think, calculations and memory, just general cognitive functioning, as well as other kind of questions. And I've also highlighted here, there are some specific questions that might relate to a particular financial decision the person is making at that time. So I mean, the advantage of this is it does assess a wide range of financial skills, and it is validated in Australia, and it does kind of incorporate that, that legal definition of capacity. But the downsides of this is sometimes the knowledge really relies on a person's personal knowledge and experience of making, for example, decisions about estate management. It's not something that everyone would have experience with. And some items also need verification by an informant. But I think the major downside with a test like this one is that it's quite outdated. So there are questions about balancing checkbooks and things that people don't really do anymore. And the fact that it's not widely available, it's quite difficult to get hold of this test. And finally, there's no specific items for risk of financial exploitation or scam susceptibility, that sort of thing. So with that in mind, I really set out to use this sort of test, but there are lots of, I guess, limitations of the financial skills measures that we currently use in the clinic. So firstly, a lot of them are self or informant reported, or interviews or questionnaires. So this can be quite susceptible to bias. If the clinician doesn't know to specifically ask, how are you doing with your finances, or are you having any difficulties there, people might not necessarily report that because they might think, oh, that's not relevant for my doctor to know. Or, the appropriate questions might not be asked. Secondly, there's a real lack of measures at the moment that are objective and performance-based. So being able to say, oh yeah, I set aside money, or I know when to pay bills, is quite different to actually paying the bill, or doing the calculation or making a judgment. And because of this, there's a real lack of ecologically valid and up-to-date measures as well. So saying you can do something and actually doing it the way you would typically pay a bill or budget your household income is quite different. And as I mentioned before, that the definition of financial capacity is decision specific. So it's not related to a person's overall financial skills, but really focused on whether that person has capacity to make that particular financial decision at that point of time. So it's not, I guess, not as general as financial skills assessment. Okay, so you might ask, why should we bother assessing financial skills in the clinic? Is it important at all? Like, what do we achieve by doing this? So I'll argue that there are a few reasons why it's a good thing to do this. So, for example, diagnosis. So to provide more of an objective and ecologically valid evidence, if any, of decline in financial skills. And this is quite important actually, because sometimes, and this has actually was published last year, sometimes we find that changes in a person's financial capability might actually be an early sign of dementia. So this is a study that was conducted in the US, and this is a really unique study because they linked people's Medicare data to their, or whatever the US equivalent of Medicare is, their medical records, to their credit ratings. So linking of medical records and financial records. And they found that on average, people who were diagnosed with dementia were showing changes in their credit scores up to 6 years prior to their diagnosis of dementia. So changes in credit scores, so for example, things like not paying their bills on time, or overspending on credit card bills and things like that. So if using this kind of big data approach, the authors were able to identify these quite specific changes in people with dementia. So perhaps picking up on these difficulties that people might have with finances might actually help with earlier diagnosis. Second reason why it's important to assess financial skills is really to guide the implementation of interventions and management strategies. So I don't know how it might be in the UK, but often what happens in Australia is the GP or the geriatrician or someone will write, this person has no capacity, and that is it. They have no access to the bank account, they get a guardian in, and they lose all sense of autonomy in their everyday everyday tasks and things like that. Even though they might be perfectly capable of managing their everyday finances and handling cash and things like that, but might need perhaps a bit more support in big financial decisions like selling their house. So really, by assessing this broad range of financial skills, it's really helpful to be able to guide implementation of interventions in a way that supports a person's autonomy without kind of taking away all their freedom. And I guess this leads to my next point about, developing interventions. So by understanding the cognitive and social emotional mechanisms that might drive these changes in the person's financial skills, we can then develop more targeted interventions. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, it might be more helpful to support a person's memory rather than in behavioural variant FTD, where it might be more helpful to support their emotion recognition or social cognitive abilities. So hopefully I'll convince you all that it's a good idea to be assessing financial skills, because then that leads to what I've been doing for the past few years, which is developing a new neuropsych test of financial skills, which we've given the acronym of TOFS, but I'm not sure if that's a good acronym, but that's what we went with, so here we are. Okay, so the test has 3 sections. One whole section focusing on more everyday sorts of financial skills. So things like handling cash, understanding how much things cost, paying bills, and everyday household budgeting. The real innovation of this test, we think, is section 2, which really focuses on scam susceptibility. So being able to identify suspicious looking emails or letters or ads and things like that, having insight into what scammers might do. There's also a measure of gullibility and knowledge of what to do, what to look out for when trying to spot whether something is a scam or not. And then section 3 really tries to tap into these what we've called higher level financial judgment and knowledge. So a lot of kind of reasoning and problem solving, being able to understand legal terminology, and also describe and kind of talk through their financial goals. So this was developed, it was a long development process, and we started collecting data in end of 2019, and then of course COVID happened. So we quickly pivoted to, instead of testing in person, we did a lot of testing over Zoom. So luckily most of the materials were easily transferable, apart from the hand and cash part. So we've been very busy collecting lots of data in people, and that's right, here's some examples of the sorts of questions. So the first section, really about handling cash, identifying coins and notes, and counting money and things like that. There's a real focus also on providing the details so that people don't need to hold information in memory, so it's not a memory test. And there's also a real focus on allowing working out paper and calculations, a calculator and things like that, so people don't need to rely on mental arithmetic. And then there are a couple of questions with realistic looking stimuli. For example, this credit card bill. So questions like, when is it due? How much is due? If you pay it late, how much is the late payment fee? And this is an example of the household kind of budgeting item, where people are asked to rank the order they would be paying for certain things if they have a limited amount of money. So you'd hope that people would be prioritizing their groceries over a magazine subscription, for example. Oh, and this is an example of some of the stimuli that we present in the part 2 of the test. So an example of an email that you might receive, and people need to rate how suspicious they might be of this particular email. And there are some scam items and some genuine or like real items mixed in as well. So we look at the difference between their ratings for scam items and genuine items. Although for reference, these are both scams. Okay, and then these are more scenario-based questions. So asking what people would do if they are approached by people to give away personal details or sign up for things they might not necessarily need. And more kind of long-term financial planning sorts of questions. And, it took a long time to really work out the scoring guide for this as well, because it is quite open-ended. But yeah, there are specific rules for what to do and when to prompt for further details. With the legal terminology, one thing we did do was actually make it hopefully realistic to everyday life. So firstly, you ask the person, what is the purpose of a will, and write down, what their response is. Then also ask them again once they've been given the opportunity to read a information brochure. So if given the relevant information, are they able to identify and pick out, what the relevant information is? So it's not just financial knowledge, but also financial learning, I guess knowledge learning as well. Okay, and then so that's some examples of questions. This is what we have in terms of, there's also the informant-rated equivalent of the objective performance-based measure. So we asked an informant to rate their financial skills on this scale, and the questions match up to each of the actual objective performance-based measures. So then we can look at construct validity and also the match between subjective and objective measures. Okay, so I do have some preliminary data today. There is a bit more of a way to go with our Alzheimer's patients, but we were able to collect quite a lot of control data. And this is just to show, I guess, general demographics. I might just skip through that. But yeah, so here we see, this is the TOFS total score. Pleasingly, of course, we see that the controls are doing better than the patient groups. And we do see this nice stepwise change, I guess, between the MCI and AD patients as well. But it's more interesting when we break it down into the subsections. So in this figure, the 3 parts have slightly different number of items, I guess. So I've indicated here on the dotted line the maximum score that a person can get on each of the 3 sections. So with the everyday financial skills, we can see that actually both the AD and behavioural variant FTD patients are pretty similar, but the MCI patients are closer to control level. But where you see a real interesting difference is in the scam susceptibility section, where the behavioural variant FTD patients are performing particularly worse. And this really mimics what we saw in that earlier study with the informant-rated measures on the gullibility scale. And interestingly, actually, the patients aren't doing drastically worse in the higher order financial judgment and knowledge section. So we may need to kind of work a bit more on the scoring guide and working out what this actually really means. We also had a quick look at the correlations between informant and objective performance measures. And what's really interesting here is even though the scores are quite strongly correlated in part 2 and 3, this doesn't necessarily seem to be the case for part 1. So the correlation is much weaker here. And so this could mean that either people are performing much better than we think, and informants are rating their skills as lower, or the other way around, which both options are not very good. So what people rate their skills are doesn't seem to be matching up with how they're actually performing. So we need to delve further into this to see whether they're overrating or underrating. And this really is important, because then we can go back to the family members and say, well, actually, you might think they have trouble budgeting or handling cash, but actually they can do it pretty well themselves. So this can help kind of give the person a bit more sense of autonomy and give them a little bit more responsibility than what their family members think they are capable of. Or the other way around. Maybe they're doing really terribly and their family members are giving them too much autonomy. But yeah, so lots to do there. But I thought I'd also briefly touch on one study that my honours student just completed a couple of weeks ago now. And this is looking more specifically at that scam ads section of the task and its relationship with carer-rated gullibility scores. So here, in comparing the behavioural variant FTD patients with healthy older controls, we see that they're performing worse on being able to pick up which ads are scams and which ones are genuine. And again, this is the same gullibility score, so they're scoring much higher, they're more gullible than the older adults. And we see a nice positive correlation between performance on the task as well as the objective measure. It's positive because we then can switch the scoring of the scale so that higher scores were lower gullibility. So those who were better at identifying the scams were also rated as less gullible. Hopefully I have enough time to quickly go through this as well. So another project we've got going on is developing an online version of the TOFS. So we were funded by the Extra Foundation to do this particular project, and we're really interested in, I guess, translating the test from a quite lengthy neuropsych administered or clinician administered version to a self-administered mini online version. So for this particular project, we converted all of the clinician administered items so that people could do them by themselves online. So for example, instead of asking people to point out certain parts of the bill, we had to make it multiple choice so people could click on different parts of the bill to identify, how much it costs and things like that. So it took some time to convert that. And then we collected data in quite a large sample of healthy older adults who did the online self-administered version of the test. And we also collected a bunch of people who did both versions to look at alternate form reliability. Oh, I'm happy to report that is quite good, so they are measuring the same things. And then we did a rash analysis to reduce the number of items to pick out the most useful ones to include in this online version of the test. So we reduced part 1 from 23 to 5 items, and then 4 and 6 items to part 2 and 3. So at the moment, we're currently in the process of the web development, so the website development, where we're putting the mini version of the test onto a free website. So I think I have some, oh yeah, so for example, this is the cash handling question. So instead of, asking people to pass you coins and stuff, you just kind of drag and drop to make that amount into the box in there. And this is an example of what the credit card item might look like. So people just need to type in what the amount due is. And then this is an example of one of those scam items. So giving a rating, whether it's suspicious, not suspicious, or not sure. Oh, yeah, that's all the screenshots I have. So this is where we're at the moment. But the idea is once you finish the test and input your responses, it goes to the results section where the test is scored, and you get a little sort of report card. And the report card kind of goes through the different sections of the test and makes any recommendations, whether you're doing well on this, whether you might need support, whether it's an area of concern. So the idea is people can kind of do this as a sort of financial health check and get some sort
Hi, Steph. Sorry to interrupt, but we lost your sound.
Is that better? Yeah. Hopefully everyone can hear me again. Okay. Cool. Well, hopefully no one missed too much, but I was saying something about profiles of dementia and different profiles of exploitation and errors, and these seem to be underlined by different types of social and social-emotional and cognitive factors. So by understanding what really is driving these kind of outward financial difficulties, we can understand how to develop interventions and how to support people. And hopefully I will convince you all that it's really important to assess for financial skills in the clinic, and it's really an area of unmet need, because at the moment what tends to happen is neuropsychologists will rely on their own set of questions about financial decisions, or they might rely on the person's ability to, I don't know, the person's working memory or their executive functions, which it is a proxy measure of how well they are performing cognitively in general, but it's not as ecologically valid as a test where we're actually asking people to do these financial tasks. And so improved assessment, for example, will help with early detection, will help us improve how we care for and manage people with dementia, or just aging people in general. And hopefully, by understanding these underlying cognitive and social emotional factors, we can then develop more targeted interventions. And ultimately the idea is really to support the people's independence and improve their well-being, and not just taking away all of their autonomy. And hopefully by doing this might have downstream impacts on also reducing other behavioural changes and really improving carer burden, for example. So I think I'll stop there. Of course, as always, thanks to participants and their families for contributing to this research, plus all the different funding bodies. I'm happy to take any questions, or there are my contact details as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steph. That was a great overview of your work you've done in financial capability. Amazing, and developing a new tool. So we have time for questions. If you have any questions, we can go maybe through the chat. But maybe I start with the first one.
Okay.
So very often people have, of course, one person leads the financial decision making in a family.
Yeah.
So do you take that into account when you do the assessment? So
yeah.
Somebody might have a lot of experience, other people might have very little experience.
Yeah, I don't know if it popped up in there. As part of the questions, we don't score them, but we also ask people, are you the person who pays the bills in your household? And they say yes or no, or sometimes we get some really interesting answers. And it's like, oh, I only do the electricity and my wife does the whatever. So we do get a sense of their general level of experience. And we also compare that to what the informant has said in the questionnaire version as well.
Because, I can see that might influence quite a lot. Well, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we go out of this lecture and have a look if there are any questions in the chat. There we go. Please. Can you scroll up maybe?
Oh. Oops. Sounds turned off. Okay, I might go back up.
Okay, if we go this. Okay. So Nada has a question. Really great new scale. I have a couple of questions on the honours project. Was there specific rationale to compare behavioral activity with older adults? And could middle-aged adults have been better comparative group?
Yes, actually, that's a really good point. So that's a really good point, Anita. So on that particular figure that I showed, it said older adults, but the older adults were actually matched to the same age as the behavioural variant activity patients. I think the reason why my student had popped older adults as the label was because we also compared older versus younger adults in a separate part of the study, which was also really interesting, looking at, and this was just data we collected in first year psychology students. And it was actually pretty surprising to see how questionable their financial skills were. But that might be an artifact of first year students not paying their bills. So
It's experience, maybe.
yeah.
I think there was a follow-up practical question.
Oh yes, how long does a regular TOFS take? So the regular one takes about 30 minutes to administer in person. It took a little bit longer on Zoom. It was just a little bit fiddly with the screen sharing and the, can you hear me? No, can't hear you, can't see you, things like that. But yeah, so it's about 30 minutes.
Great. If we scroll down, see. Okay. Oh, there was one. If you go a bit up. Go a bit up.
Oh, here we go.
So Alison Effort is asking. Oh no, sorry.
Oh, is there a link to get the questionnaire?
Yeah.
Not at the moment, but once we've published the validation study, and the aim is to make everything pretty much freely available. So I don't believe in the whole charging people for access to test things. So yeah, watch out. Hopefully next year we'll have it published.
You know, next year is very soon.
Well, okay, not beginning of next year. Okay. Anita asks.
So, no, can you read it?
Oh yeah. So Anita asks. I'm also wondering if the carer may not be able to appropriately appraise the financial skills of the person with dementia if they're not confident on the financial tasks either, or did you have expectations of the carer questionnaire? Yeah, that's a tricky question. We don't really have any other, I guess, way to get an informed rating of the person's abilities. So I think partly the reason why we did the carer versus the performance-based was to validate the performance-based, but also it's bringing up some really interesting questions or issues about, whether the carers themselves are the best person to ask and whether they do have a good handle or idea of what the person is capable of. So I think eventually in clinical practice, what would be great is if you do detect a big discrepancy between the performance-based measure and the carer-based measure, you can then sit down with the patient and the carer together and really point this out to really help them manage their expectations and say, well, actually, this person is doing much better than you think. Or the other way around, you might even get more support here. I think it's useful from a clinical sense.
Have a look at another.
So regarding the mini TOFS, I'd also be curious about how well older adults navigate this type of task. Technology. Yeah, that's interesting. So as part of the validation study for the mini TOFS, we also collected, I guess, just self-rated measures of computer proficiency. And I think one of the downsides of collecting data online and getting people to participate through online recruitment is you do have a skewed data set of people who are confident with technology and are able to complete the test. So we didn't find, we found that the people who participated did have quite high levels of computer proficiency. So unfortunately, we can't really tell if people are struggling more with technology, how they would do with the online version. But yeah, definitely something we're going to be addressing through the web development process. So once we finalize the website, we're also going to do a series of focus groups and I guess work from more the UX design sort of interface to make sure that the website is accessible and feasible for older adults to use.
Yes, and clearly lots of people, I think, would pay also bills online.
Finances
online. So if they manage to do the finances online, it should be cheaper.
Should be.
Theoretically.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, where are we?
Great.
I think that's it. Right.
I think we haven't forgotten any other questions. Does anybody else have any other questions? So are you planning then to launch this? I think the question is, it might be really interesting, of course, to also do this here in the UK. interested in validating it here in the UK.
Yeah, so obviously some things are quite Australian specific. So, for example, the whole section on guardianship and power of attorney, like what is a power of attorney, what is an enduring power of attorney, I'm sure we have similar concepts.
No, it would be quite similar, yes.
But actually, fun fact, across the different states of Australia, there are slightly different definitions.
Yes.
Just because.
Yes. I think Bridget has a question. Bridget, do you want to come on and ask you a question?
Yes, sounds really good.
Yes, if possible, please. I put the question into the chat, but because I couldn't find Q&A. But
I don't think the sound is on.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I don't think we can hear you here, the lecture theatre. Sorry.
Oh dear, it's in. Look in the chat.
Can you hear it, Dan? No. Yeah, we don't have sound, I'm afraid, here.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
See
we
you.
can see you briefly, but yeah, we can't hear you, I'm afraid. I think it's our lecture theatre here where we don't have.
Yeah, it might be better if you
Maybe if you could type it in the meantime, yeah, we can.
I typed it
So
into the
you're going
chat
to
bar.
expand it now. So for you, do you think it would be more relevant? Like, I guess the next question is, that, you know, looking at MCI and the progression to dementia. So longitudinal changes, are you going to look into that?
Oh, it'd be great to look into that. I'm definitely planning to, but yeah, see.
Because if people, yeah, if you can detect, because people might be able to handle their or maybe, as you say, the everyday finances, they might be still able to handle it at the beginning, but then there might be a stage where, again, it might be better to take that.
Yeah. The idea would be to next step to validate longitudinal use of the test as well, and also in different populations. I think that'd be really interesting. And also one day, if we wanted to test different types of interventions and use this as kind of pre-post, for example, like cybersecurity training, whether that would help people in detecting scams or not. Whether there's a change.
I think the exploitation in this count is fascinating, of course. It's really interesting how people now relate to this, and especially for I think it's reassuring for people that actually Alzheimer's disease, you know, people might not have that big issues, like some, but you know, less than if you have really like frontotemporal dementia instead. So that's quite reassuring, I think. But still, it's something that people are worried about.
I am slightly concerned though that, like, you know, scammers and go so good these days.
It's true,
I don't know if like
true.
the
You don't have
stimuli going to be updated
Exactly.
enough.
You don't need to diagnose of dementia before.
No,
That's a very important point to remember.
Mm.
Now, Bridget, I'm not sure you can still type your question. I'm not.
Oh, okay.
This is an ADA again. It has
Yes.
question.
I did see the C-STAM that's in development at Chiba, and I've been part of the online Delphi process that they've been doing to refine the IADL assessment. But yeah, they do have a question on financial assessment. Which is really great to see, like an online sort of.
Jump back.
Oh, okay. I think this assessment's pretty fancy as well. But yeah, it's more of a broader IADL assessment.
Great. Well, maybe, Bridget, sorry about this, but maybe you could, if you want to, you can also email me your question if you want to, and I can forward it to Steph if you want to have that answered.
Yeah.
So just to say thank you again, Steph, for giving
me
a talk. And we have next week, we have another extraordinary seminar, another visitor from Australia, and talking about memory in front of dementia. So, oh, there we go. Bridget came through, actually.
Okay. So wondering about implications of the tool for prevention of elder financial abuse. Can it be used for practitioners working in the area? Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I was talking to Michael about this earlier. Unfortunately, the majority of financial abuse, in particular, is inflicted by people's family members or people known to the patient themselves. So, unfortunately, this sort of test won't be too useful at picking up, a person's susceptibility to financial abuse or exploitation by people they know. but it could possibly give a kind of hint towards, their susceptibility. But yeah, financial abuse is such a bigger area and a bigger concern to tackle. I would love to do something about it, but I don't know, it's pretty tricky.
Yeah. Great. Excellent. Well, I think Dan put also the information for the next week's seminar. And so thank you again, Steph, and thank you all for coming.